The parking attendant at the Palmer Events Center looked at my beat-up Honda Civic like it had personally offended him. I handed him the keys and watched him reluctantly take them, probably wondering how someone driving a 12-year-old car with a cracked bumper had ended up at Austin's most exclusive corporate awards ceremony. I didn't blame him for the confusion. I was wondering the same thing myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I adjusted my blazer, the only one I owned that didn't have coffee stains on it, and walked toward the gleaming glass entrance, where men in $1,000 suits were greeting each other like old fraternity brothers. The invitation in my pocket felt heavier than it should have, considering it was just a piece of cardstock with my father's name printed in elegant script. David Rodriguez, 15 years of dedicated service to TechCore Solutions. Tonight was his night, his moment to shine in front of the company that had become his entire identity. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. The invitation had come addressed to the Rodriguez family, with a note scrawled in my mother's handwriting that said, "Emma, please try to look professional. This is important for your father." No personal message from him. No acknowledgement that I might actually want to celebrate his achievement. Just the assumption that I had nothing better to do on a Thursday night than show up and play the supportive daughter role. The lobby buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from putting 200 tech executives in one room with an open bar. I recognized the atmosphere immediately, though I'd never experienced it from this angle. Usually, I was on the outside looking in, watching these events from behind a laptop screen while tracking market movements and investor meetings that these same people attended. Tonight I was just David Rodriguez's daughter, the one who couldn't seem to get her life together. I spotted my family before they saw me. Dad stood near the registration table wearing his best Navy suit, the one he'd bought specifically for company events like this. He was shaking hands with colleagues, his chest puffed out with the pride of a man who'd finally made it to the inner circle, even if it was just for one evening. Mom hovered beside him in a dress that screamed, "supportive corporate wife," her smile frozen in place as she nodded along to conversations about quarterly projections and market penetration strategies she didn't understand but pretended to find fascinating. Tyler was there too, of course. My older brother commanded attention even in a room full of executives, his perfectly tailored suit and confident handshake marking him as someone who belonged in these circles. Ashley, his wife, clung to his arm like a designer accessory, her law degree from UT apparently qualifying her to offer opinions on everything from tax policy to venture capital funding. They looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate lifestyle magazine, the kind of couple that gets featured in Austin's Rising Stars Under 35 Inches articles. I hung back near the registration table, watching the dynamic play out like I had so many times before. Tyler was holding court, telling some story about a merger he'd helped close, while Dad beamed with the kind of pride he'd never shown when I tried to explain what I'd been working on for the past 3 years. The few times I'd attempted to describe my projects, his eyes had glazed over before I'd gotten past the second sentence. "Tech stuff," he'd say with a dismissive wave. "When are you going to get a real job?" The registration volunteer, a young woman with a TechCore badge, smiled brightly as I approached. "Good evening. Are you here for the awards ceremony?" I nodded and pulled out my phone to show her the digital invitation. She scanned it quickly, her expression shifting slightly as she read the details. "Oh, you're with the Rodriguez family. Your father's receiving the Excellence in Project Management Award tonight. That's wonderful. You must be so proud." I smiled and accepted the program she handed me, the glossy cover featuring the TechCore logo and the tagline, "Celebrating Innovation and Leadership." Inside, I found my father's name listed among the honorees, along with a brief description of his contributions to the company's client management systems. 15 years of steady, reliable work that had earned him respect among his peers, and a modest salary increase every few years. It was the kind of career trajectory that made sense to everyone who knew him, predictable and safe. What they didn't know was that 3 blocks away, in a converted warehouse space downtown, servers were humming with code I'd written, processing transactions that would fundamentally change how small businesses managed their supply chains. What they didn't know was that the unemployment they whispered about at family gatherings was actually 18-hour days spent building something that would make TechCore's client management system look like a calculator compared to a supercomputer. But tonight wasn't about me. Tonight was about Dad and his moment of recognition. I could play the supportive daughter role for a few hours, smile politely when people asked what I was doing these days, and deflect questions about my career with vague answers about working in tech. It wasn't like anyone in this room would understand the difference between what I was building and what they considered legitimate business anyway. I found an empty table toward the back of the ballroom, close enough to see the stage but far enough away to avoid the small talk that would inevitably turn into career advice from people who thought success meant climbing someone else's corporate ladder. The room was filling up now, the cocktail hour energy shifting into something more formal as people began taking their seats. I watched my family settle into their reserved table near the front, Tyler already engaged in animated conversation with the couple beside them while Dad nervously adjusted his tie. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sitting alone at the back of a corporate awards ceremony, while 3 blocks away, the biggest venture capital firm in Texas was reviewing term sheets for a funding round that would value my company at more than TechCore's entire annual revenue. Tomorrow morning, while Dad was back at his desk managing client spreadsheets, I'd be sitting across from investors who were betting that my unemployment was about to disrupt an entire industry. But for now, I was just Emma Rodriguez, the daughter who couldn't get her act together, watching her father receive recognition for 15 years of playing it safe, while I'd spent 3 years building something that scared me and thrilled me in equal measure. The lights began to dim, and James Mitchell, TechCore's CEO, stepped up to the podium with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to wonder where your next paycheck will come from. I settled back in my chair and prepared to watch my father's moment of triumph, unaware that in exactly 47 minutes, this entire room would discover that the unemployed daughter sitting in the back had been building the future while they'd been managing the present. The pattern had started so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first. It wasn't a single moment of rejection or dismissal, but rather a slow erosion of expectations that began somewhere around my sophomore year of college. While Tyler was graduating summa cum laude from UT Law and already fielding offers from prestigious firms, I was changing my major for the 3rd time and spending more hours in the computer lab than in lecture halls. I remember the exact moment when Dad stopped asking about my grades and started asking when I was going to figure things out. It was during winter break of my junior year, when Tyler had just received news of his acceptance to the bar exam prep program. The whole family was gathered around the dinner table, celebrating Tyler's latest achievement with Mom's famous tres leches cake and Dad's carefully hoarded bottle of Patron. "So, Emma," Dad had said, turning to me with the kind of forced enthusiasm parents use when they're trying to include the child who isn't living up to expectations, "how are your classes going this semester?" I'd started to explain my fascination with emerging technologies, how I was teaching myself programming languages that weren't even offered in the curriculum, how I'd been working with a professor on a research project that could revolutionize data processing for small businesses. His eyes had glazed over before I'd finished the first sentence. "That's nice, Mija," he'd said, already turning back to Tyler. "But what's your actual major now? And please tell me you're not changing it again." The conversation had moved on before I could answer, shifting to Tyler's internship prospects and Ashley's law review articles. I'd sat there, picking at my cake, while my family discussed Tyler's trajectory toward partnership track positions and 6-figure starting salaries. That night marked the beginning of what I privately called the Great Diminishing. It wasn't malicious, just a gradual adjustment of expectations. Tyler was the son who would carry on the family name with distinction, while I was the daughter who needed to eventually find stability, preferably through marriage to someone with a more traditional career path. The questions about my future became less frequent and more pointed toward conventional outcomes. "Have you thought about teaching?" Mom would ask during our monthly phone calls. "You're so good with computers, maybe you could teach high school computer science. Good benefits, summers off, stable schedule." When I tried to explain that I was building something, that I was working 18-hour days on projects that could change entire industries, she'd make sympathetic noises and ask if I was eating enough vegetables. Dad's approach was more direct. "When I was your age," he'd say during our increasingly rare one-on-one conversations, "I knew I needed to provide for a family someday. I found a good company, worked hard, and built a career. TechCore might seem boring to you, but it's given us a good life. The implication was clear. What I was doing wasn't real work, wasn't building toward anything substantial, wasn't the kind of foundation on which responsible adults built their lives. The worst part wasn't the dismissal itself, but the way it became a family narrative that everyone accepted without question. At Tyler's engagement party, relatives I hadn't seen in years would ask what I was doing, and before I could answer, someone would jump in with, "Oh, Emma's still figuring things out. She's very creative, you know." Creative had become code for unemployed, unfocused, not quite ready for the real world. During Tyler's wedding reception, I'd overheard my aunt telling someone, "David's so proud of Tyler. He's already making more money than his father, and he's only been practicing law for 2 years. Now if only Emma could find her direction." I'd been standing 3 feet away, having just closed a development contract worth more than Tyler's annual salary. But I was invisible in that conversation. My successes didn't translate into dinner table talking points. The technology sector moves differently than traditional industries. Success isn't measured in promotions or corner offices or company holiday parties. It's measured in lines of code that solve problems nobody else has figured out how to address. It's measured in user growth rates and venture capital interest, and the kind of innovation that makes established companies scramble to catch up. But try explaining that to a man who's spent 15 years climbing the same corporate ladder, whose definition of professional achievement is tied to office locations and parking space assignments. I'd learned to stop trying. When family gatherings inevitably turned to career updates, I developed a repertoire of vague responses that satisfied their need to ask without revealing anything that might confuse or concern them. "Still working in tech," I'd say with a smile, keeping busy with various. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Projects. They'd nod and move on to discussing Tyler's latest case or Ashley's promotion to senior associate. The isolation wasn't just about being misunderstood, it was about carrying knowledge that felt too big for family dinners. While Tyler was helping corporations navigate tax law, I was building systems that could automate entire supply chains. While Dad was managing client relationships at TechCore, I was creating technology that would make traditional client management obsolete. But there was no way to communicate that without sounding either arrogant or delusional. The night I landed my first major angel investor, I'd called home with the intention of sharing the news. It was a 7-figure commitment from a fund that had backed 3 companies that later went public. I was 26 years old and someone had just bet their money on my vision of the future. When Dad answered the phone, I could hear Tyler in the background talking about a partnership track timeline. "Hey Dad, I have some exciting news," I'd started. "I just secured funding for my startup. A major investor believes in what we're building." There was a pause, the kind that happens when someone is trying to process information that doesn't fit their existing framework. "That's great, Mija," he'd said eventually. "Does this mean you're going to have a regular paycheck now? Your mother's been worried about your health insurance situation?" I'd tried to explain that the funding meant validation, that it meant sophisticated investors believed my technology could scale, that it meant I was building something that could employ hundreds of people and generate millions in revenue. But the conversation kept returning to practical concerns about benefits and retirement planning and whether I'd finally be able to afford a reliable car. That's when I realized that my family's inability to understand what I was building wasn't really about technology or industry knowledge. It was about risk tolerance and definitions of success and the comfortable predictability of traditional career paths. They couldn't celebrate what they couldn't comprehend, and I couldn't fault them for that. But I also couldn't keep trying to translate my world into terms that would make sense at Sunday dinner. So I'd learned to compartmentalize. My professional life existed in co-working spaces and late-night video calls with developers in different time zones. My family life existed in suburban kitchens, where Tyler's latest court victory was front-page news while my latest product launch was mentioned in passing. The two worlds rarely intersected, and I'd convinced myself that was probably for the best. But sitting in the Palmer Events Center, watching Dad receive recognition for 15 years of steady, predictable work, I felt the weight of that compartmentalization. In 3 days, TechCore would announce their partnership with my company, a deal that would integrate my supply chain management system into their existing client services platform. In 3 days, Dad would learn that his unemployed daughter had built the technology that would drive his company's next phase of growth. Tonight, though, I was still just Emma, the daughter who couldn't seem to get her act together, sitting alone at the back of a corporate awards ceremony while my family celebrated Tyler's conventional success and Dad's milestone achievement. The irony felt heavy enough to crush the air out of my lungs, but I smiled and applauded when they called Dad's name, playing my role in a story where I'd somehow become the supporting character in my own life. Tyler had always been the golden child, but it wasn't just birth order that secured his position as the family's crown jewel. From the moment he could walk, he seemed to understand the rules of success that everyone else played by. He colored inside the lines, literally and figuratively. He brought home report cards that made Mom cry with pride, and Dad pull out his phone to show coworkers. He played varsity football, not because he was particularly athletic, but because he understood that being team captain would look good on college applications. While I was taking apart old computers in the garage to see how they worked, Tyler was methodically planning his route to valedictorian. While I stayed up until 3 in the morning teaching myself coding languages from YouTube tutorials, Tyler was getting a full 8 hours of sleep because he knew proper rest was essential for peak academic performance. He approached childhood like a project manager, breaking down long-term goals into achievable milestones and executing each phase with military precision. The contrast became most apparent during our high school years. Tyler would bring home assignments weeks before they were due, spread them across the dining room table, and work through them with the same systematic approach Dad used for his quarterly reports at TechCore. I would disappear into my room with a laptop and emerge days later with something I'd built from scratch, some app or program that solved a problem I'd identified. But Tyler's approach always earned the praise. "Tyler has such good study habits," Mom would tell her friends over coffee. "He's going to do so well in college." When those same friends asked about me, Mom's response was always more cautious. "Emma's very bright, but she's not as focused. She gets distracted by all these computer things instead of concentrating on her grades." The computer things were advanced programming projects that would have impressed most software engineers. But explaining that to Mom was like describing quantum physics to someone who still struggled with basic arithmetic. She couldn't see the complexity or the skill involved because it didn't translate into letter grades or class rankings or the kind of achievements that could be easily explained to relatives at Christmas dinner. Tyler's acceptance to UT Law was treated like a family holiday. Dad took a half-day off work to drive down and tour the campus with him. Mom organized a celebration dinner at the nicest restaurant in Austin, inviting extended family and family friends to share in the momentous occasion. There were speeches about legacy and tradition, and the pride of watching your son follow in the footsteps of great legal minds. When I got my first freelance programming contract during my sophomore year of college, earning more in 3 months than most of my classmates made in summer jobs, the family response was markedly different. "That's nice, Micha," Dad had said when I mentioned it during a phone call. "But make sure you're not neglecting your actual coursework. Remember, you need to graduate." The assumption was always that what I was doing was a hobby, a side interest that might be profitable in the short term but wasn't building toward anything substantial. Programming was something people did in their spare time, not a foundation for a serious career. Real careers required degrees and job interviews and benefits packages, and the kind of structured progression that Tyler was following. Tyler's law school graduation was another family celebration. This time we rented a private dining room at Jeffrey's, and Dad gave a toast about watching his son become the kind of man who could change the world through the judicial system. Ashley was there, radiant in her role as the supportive girlfriend, who would soon become the perfect legal wife. She'd already been accepted to a master's program in public policy, creating a power couple narrative that everyone found deeply satisfying. I'd driven down from Dallas, where I was working with a team of developers on a supply chain optimization platform that would eventually become the foundation of my company. I'd been putting in 16-hour days for months, surviving on coffee, and the kind of manic energy that comes from building something revolutionary. But at that dinner table, surrounded by extended family and Tyler's law school friends, I was just the younger sister who still hadn't figured out what she wanted to be when she grew up. Emma's still exploring her options, Mom would say when people asked about my plans. She's very creative with computers. Creative had become the family's diplomatic way of saying unemployed. It suggested artistic inclination rather than professional incompetence. But it also implied that what I was doing wasn't quite serious, wasn't quite real work. Tyler's first job offer came with a signing bonus larger than most people's annual salaries. The law firm flew him to Houston for interviews, put him up in a 5-star hotel, and courted him like a professional athlete. When he accepted the position, Dad called everyone he knew to share the news. Tyler would be starting as an associate at one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in Texas, with a clear path toward partnership and the kind of earning potential that could support the lifestyle he'd always envisioned. My first major client contract came through at almost exactly the same time. A Fortune 500 company had hired me to redesign their entire inventory management system, a project that would take 8 months and pay more than Tyler would make in his first 2 years of practice. But there was no signing bonus, no corporate courtship, no clear trajectory that family members could understand and celebrate. When I tried to explain the significance of the contract, the response was polite confusion. "That sounds complicated," Mom had said. "Are you sure you're not taking on too much? Maybe you should focus on finishing school first." The suggestion that I might be overextending myself by accepting a 6-figure contract would have been laughable if it hadn't been so frustrating. Tyler's wedding was the culmination of everything the family valued about conventional success. He married Ashley in a ceremony that could have been featured in a magazine about achieving the American dream. She was beautiful, educated, professionally accomplished, and came from a family that understood the importance of building wealth through traditional means. Together, they represented everything Dad had hoped his children would become. I was the maid of honor, which sounds more significant than it actually felt. My role was essentially ceremonial, holding Ashley's bouquet during the vows and making sure her train didn't get caught in the church doors. During the reception, I listened to speeches about Tyler's bright future, about the law practice he would build, about the family he and Ashley would raise with the same values that had shaped his success. When it came time for my speech, I kept it brief and generic, talking about Tyler's determination and Ashley's kindness, and wishing them happiness in their life together. I didn't mention that the week before their wedding, I'd closed a funding round that valued my startup at more than most people make in a lifetime. I didn't mention that I'd been invited to speak at a technology conference where I'd be presenting to some of the most innovative minds in the industry. Those accomplishments existed in a parallel universe that didn't intersect with family weddings and traditional celebrations. The pattern was so consistent that I began to anticipate it. Tyler's achievements would be celebrated with family gatherings and phone calls to relatives and social media posts that generated dozens of congratulatory comments. My achievements would be acknowledged with polite interest and immediate redirection toward more practical concerns about health insurance and retirement planning. It wasn't malicious, just a fundamental inability to recognize value that didn't fit established categories. Tyler's success was measurable in ways that made sense to people who understood traditional career progression. Partner track positions and annual salary increases and corporate benefits packages were achievements that could be easily communicated and compared. Building revolutionary technology from scratch was too abstract, too uncertain, too far outside the realm of normal professional experience. By the time Tyler made partner, the family dynamic was completely established. He was the son who had exceeded expectations, building the kind of career that would provide security and status and the ability to raise children with even better opportunities. I was the daughter who had potential but lacked direction, who was smart but impractical, who might eventually find stability if I could learn to be more realistic about my goals. The irony was that Tyler's success, impressive as it was, operated within existing systems while I was building the systems that would replace them. He was mastering the rules of today's economy, while I was writing the rules for tomorrow's. But that distinction was invisible to a family that measured achievement in terms they could understand and celebrate and share with pride at neighborhood barbecues and church gatherings. Sitting in the Palmer Events Center, watching Dad beam with pride as colleagues congratulated him on his son's legal career, I realized that tonight would be the first time my family would have to confront the gap between their perceptions and reality. In less than an hour, they would discover that the daughter they'd been diplomatically describing as, quote, creative, and still figuring things out, had built something that would fundamentally change the industry where Dad had spent his entire career. The restaurant had been Tyler's choice, naturally. Fleming's Prime Steakhouse, the kind of place where a glass of wine costs more than most people spend on groceries in a week. We were celebrating Dad's upcoming recognition ceremony, though the dinner felt more like a performance of family unity than an actual celebration. Tyler had made the reservation, selected the wine, and even pre-ordered Dad's favorite cut of steak because he knew the menu better than anyone else at the table. I'd arrived 10 minutes late, not out of disrespect, but because I'd been on a conference call with investors in Singapore. The time difference meant my most important business conversations happened during what most people considered family time. But explaining that would have required explaining what I was building, and past experience had taught me that was a conversation that led nowhere productive. "Sorry I'm late," I'd said, sliding into the empty chair between Mom and Tyler's wife Ashley. Traffic was crazy downtown. It was easier than explaining that I'd just finished presenting to a venture capital firm that was considering a $20 million investment in my supply chain platform. The lie was simpler and avoided the inevitable follow-up questions about why I was meeting with investors when I was supposedly unemployed. Tyler was already deep into a story about his latest case, something involving environmental regulations and corporate liability that had the rest of the table nodding along with practiced interest. Dad hung on every word, occasionally asking questions that showed he'd been following Tyler's career closely enough to understand the legal nuances. Mom beamed with the kind of maternal pride that comes from watching your child exceed every expectation you'd ever had. "The settlement was unprecedented," Tyler was saying, cutting into his ribeye with surgical precision. "We managed to negotiate terms that protected our client while setting a positive precedent for future environmental compliance cases. The partners are already talking about fast-tracking my promotion to senior associate." Ashley squeezed his arm affectionately. "He's being modest." The case made the front page of the legal section in the Austin Business Journal. 3 different law schools have already called asking if he'd be willing to speak to their students about innovative approaches to environmental law. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. I picked at my salmon, which probably cost more than I'd spent on food in the past week, and listened to my family discuss Tyler's trajectory toward partnership with the kind of detailed analysis usually reserved for stock market investments. They knew his billable hour requirements, his client roster, his standing within the firm hierarchy, and his timeline for making senior partner. When the conversation naturally paused, Mom turned to me with the kind of bright, determined smile she used when she was trying to include me in discussions where I clearly didn't belong. "So Emma, how are things going with your computer work? Are you still doing those freelance projects?" The question was innocent enough, but it carried the weight of 3 years' worth of conversations where my professional life had been reduced to computer work and freelance projects. My company now employed 12 full-time developers, had contracts with 7 Fortune 500 companies, and was in the final stages of securing Series A funding that would value us at over $50 million. But explaining that would require more background than a family dinner could accommodate. "Things are going well," I said, which was simultaneously the complete truth and a massive understatement. Staying busy with various projects. The vagueness was intentional. I'd learned that specificity led to questions I couldn't answer without revealing information that would either confuse or concern them. Tyler leaned forward with the kind of big brother interest that always felt slightly condescending. "Are any of these projects leading towards something more permanent? I mean, freelance work is fine for now, but eventually you'll want something with benefits, right? Stability?" The irony was almost overwhelming. Tyler's definition of stability was a law firm partnership that required 80-hour work weeks and constant pressure to generate billable hours. My definition of stability was building something revolutionary enough that other companies would pay millions to license the technology. But our definitions existed in completely different universes. "I'm exploring different options," I said, which was technically true. I was exploring acquisition offers from 3 different companies, partnership opportunities with 2 major tech firms, and venture capital investments that would fund our expansion into international markets. But those explorations weren't the kind that would make sense to people who measured career success in terms of traditional employment metrics. Dad set down his fork and looked at me with the expression he used when he was about to offer unsolicited career advice. You know, Emma, TechCore is always looking for good people. I could put in a word with our IT department. You obviously understand computers, and corporate positions come with excellent benefits. Health insurance, retirement matching, paid vacation time. The suggestion that I should consider applying for an entry-level IT position at the company, where I would soon be announced as a strategic technology partner, was so absurd that I almost laughed out loud. Instead, I nodded politely and said I'd keep that in mind. It was easier than explaining that TechCore's entire IT infrastructure was about to be revolutionized by the platform I'd spent 3 years building. Ashley jumped into the conversation with the kind of helpful enthusiasm that came from someone who'd never struggled to find traditional employment. You know what might be really good for you? Corporate consulting. Companies are always looking for people who understand technology, but can also communicate with non-technical teams. You could probably make really good money helping traditional businesses modernize their systems. The suggestion was well-intentioned, but demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what I'd been doing for the past 3 years. I wasn't helping companies modernize existing systems. I was building the systems that would make their current technology obsolete. But explaining that distinction would require a level of technical detail that would glaze everyone's eyes over before I finished the first paragraph. Tyler nodded approvingly at Ashley's suggestion. That's actually brilliant. Emma, you could build a whole consulting practice around that. Start small, maybe work with some local businesses, then scale up to bigger clients. It's a much more sustainable model than these random freelance projects. The random freelance projects he was dismissing included a contract with a logistics company that was paying me more per month than he made in quarterly bonuses. But I couldn't explain that without revealing details about clients who expected confidentiality, so I smiled and said it was an interesting idea, playing along with the family's collective fantasy that I needed their career guidance. Mom reached across the table and patted my hand with maternal concern. We just want to see you settled, Mija. You're so smart, but intelligence only gets you so far without direction. Look at Tyler. He identified his goals early and worked systematically toward achieving them. That's why he's doing so well. The comparison stung not because it was unfair, but because it revealed how completely my family misunderstood both my goals and my achievements. Tyler had followed a predetermined path toward conventional success, which was admirable but hardly innovative. I had identified problems that didn't have existing solutions, and built technology to solve them. But innovation looked like instability to people who valued predictability above everything else. Dad raised his wine glass, preparing to offer one of his impromptu toasts. To Tyler, he said, his voice carrying the weight of paternal pride, for showing us what's possible when you combine intelligence with determination. And to Emma, he added after a slight pause, for reminding us that everyone finds their path at their own pace. The toast was kind, but devastating. Tyler was being celebrated for achievement while I was being consoled for potential. He had shown what was possible. I was still finding my way. The message was clear. One child had succeeded, while the other was still trying to figure out how to succeed. We clinked glasses, and I smiled through the moment, playing my assigned role as the work-in-progress sister who needed patience and encouragement, rather than recognition and respect. The wine was excellent, probably worth more than I'd spent on my entire wardrobe. But it tasted bitter with the knowledge that my family's support was conditional on my eventual transformation into someone they could understand and celebrate. The conversation moved on to other topics. Dad's recognition ceremony, Tyler's upcoming vacation with Ashley, Mom's book club selections. And I contributed just enough to avoid seeming antisocial, while my mind wandered to the presentation I'd be giving the following week to a room full of technology executives who understood exactly what I'd built and why it mattered. In that room, I wouldn't be the daughter who needed career advice or the sister who was still finding her path. I would be the CEO of a company that had solved problems other people hadn't even recognized yet. But sitting in Fleming's, surrounded by family members who loved me but couldn't see me, I was just Emma Rodriguez, the girl who was good with computers but hadn't yet learned how to transform that skill into something resembling a real career. The evening ended with hugs and promises to see each other at Dad's ceremony, along with gentle reminders about dressing appropriately and arriving on time. As we walked toward the parking garage, Tyler fell into step beside me, his expression serious in the way that meant he was about to offer big brother wisdom. "Emma," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I hope you know that everything we said tonight comes from a place of love. We just want to see you succeed. And success requires more than just being good at something. It requires strategy and planning and the kind of long-term thinking that builds security." I nodded because arguing would have required energy I didn't have and explanations that wouldn't have made sense to someone whose definition of strategy involved climbing ladders that other people had built. In 48 hours, Tyler would discover that I'd been implementing exactly the kind of long-term strategic thinking he was advocating, just on a scale and timeline that he'd never imagined possible. The reality of what I'd built over the past 3 years was something that existed in boardrooms and server farms and late-night video conferences, with developers scattered across 4 continents. While my family discussed my need for stability and direction, I was running a company that had revolutionized supply chain management for industries they'd never heard of. The gap between their perception and my reality had grown so wide that bridging it seemed impossible, until circumstances forced the truth into the open. My journey hadn't started with a grand vision or a moment of entrepreneurial inspiration. It had begun with frustration, the kind of deep, systemic irritation that comes from watching entire industries operate with technology that belonged in a museum. During my junior year of college, I'd taken a part-time job at a local logistics company, thinking it would be easy money while I finished my computer science degree. Instead, I'd walked into a nightmare of inefficiency that kept me awake at night. The company was managing supply chains for dozens of small manufacturers, tracking inventory through a combination of Excel spreadsheets, handwritten notes, and phone calls that relied on human memory more than data. Shipments were delayed because no one knew what was sitting in which warehouse. Orders were duplicated because different departments weren't communicating. Money was hemorrhaging through gaps in a system that had been cobbled together over decades without any coherent design. I'd started automating their processes during my lunch breaks, building small programs that could track inventory in real time and predict supply shortages before they became critical. What began as a way to make my own job easier evolved into something much larger when I realized that every small manufacturer in America was struggling with variations of the same problems. They needed technology that could integrate their entire supply chain, but existing solutions were either too expensive or too complex for companies that didn't have dedicated IT departments. The breakthrough had come during a weekend when I was supposed to be studying for finals. Instead, I'd spent 48 hours straight coding a prototype that could manage inventory, predict demand, coordinate with suppliers, and optimize shipping routes through a single, intuitive interface. The system was elegant in its simplicity and revolutionary in its capabilities. It could save small manufacturers hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, while reducing waste and improving customer satisfaction. I'd shown the prototype to my supervisor at the logistics company, expecting mild interest and maybe a small bonus for improving office efficiency. Instead, he'd stared at the screen for 10 minutes without speaking, then called the company owner at home on a Sunday evening. Within a week, I'd been offered a contract to implement the system company-wide. Within a month, word had spread to other manufacturers who wanted to license the technology. That was when I'd made the decision that would define the next 3 years of my life. Instead of licensing my system to individual companies, I would build a platform that could serve the entire industry. I would create a company that could scale the technology to thousands of manufacturers, generating revenue through subscriptions rather than one-time implementations. It was ambitious to the point of seeming delusional, but I could see the potential in a way that no one else seemed to understand. The early days had been exactly as difficult as everyone predicted, though for different reasons than they imagined. The technical challenges were manageable. I'd been building complex systems since high school, and the programming languages and frameworks I needed were tools I'd already mastered. The real challenge was everything else: finding investors who understood what I was building, recruiting developers who shared my vision, navigating legal and regulatory requirements that changed depending on which industries we served. I'd maxed out my credit cards, lived on ramen noodles and coffee, and worked from a shared desk in a co-working space that smelled like stale pizza and ambition. My social life had disappeared entirely. Dating became impossible when your idea of free time was debugging code at 2 in the morning. Friends from college stopped inviting me to parties because I always declined. Usually because I was on conference calls with potential clients or debugging systems that were processing millions of dollars in transactions. My family's concern during this period had been touching but misguided. They'd seen the long hours, the financial stress, and the social isolation, and concluded that I was struggling because I'd chosen an unstable career path. What they hadn't seen was the gradual accumulation of small victories that were building towards something transformative. Every bug I fixed made the system more reliable. Every new client validated the market demand. Every dollar of revenue proved that what I was building had real value. The first major milestone had come 18 months into the venture, when a mid-sized manufacturing company signed a contract worth more than my father made in a year. The client was producing automotive parts for 3 different car manufacturers, and our system had reduced their inventory costs by 30%, while improving delivery times by 40%. The success story had attracted attention from other automotive suppliers, creating a domino effect that brought in 6 new clients within 2 months. By the end of year 2, we were processing supply chain data for 47 companies across 6 different industries. Our revenue had grown from nothing to 7 figures, and I'd been able to hire a team of developers who understood the vision and could execute it at scale. We'd moved from the co-working space to a proper office in downtown Austin, with server rooms and conference facilities and the kind of infrastructure that serious technology companies required. The validation had come not just from financial success, but from industry recognition that took forms my family couldn't see or understand. I'd been invited to speak at technology conferences, where audiences of CTOs and engineering directors hung on every word. Trade publications had written articles about our platform's impact on manufacturing efficiency. Venture capital firms that typically ignored companies our size had started reaching out to discuss funding opportunities. The irony was that my family's definition of success had become completely irrelevant to the world I was operating in. They valued stability, benefits packages, and predictable career progression. The technology industry valued innovation, scalability, and the ability to solve problems that had never been solved before. Tyler's partnership track at a law firm was impressive within the context of traditional professional hierarchies, but it paled in comparison to building technology that could transform entire industries. The gap had become most apparent during family gatherings, where I'd try to explain what I was building, only to watch their eyes glaze over as soon as I mentioned terms like API integration or predictive analytics. They wanted to be supportive, but support required understanding, and understanding required a level of technical literacy that they didn't possess and didn't particularly want to develop. It was easier to nod politely and redirect the conversation toward Tyler's latest court victory, or Ashley's promotion. The breakthrough that would change everything had come 6 months ago, when James Mitchell, the CEO of TechCore Solutions, had reached out personally to discuss a potential partnership. TechCore served hundreds of clients who were struggling with exactly the problems my platform solved, and Mitchell had seen a demonstration of our technology at an industry conference. He'd understood immediately that integrating our system with TechCore's existing services could revolutionize their client offerings while generating millions in additional revenue. The negotiations had taken months, involving teams of lawyers and technical experts who examined every aspect of our platform and business model. But Mitchell had been committed from the beginning, recognizing that TechCore's future growth depended on offering cutting-edge solutions that their competitors couldn't match. The partnership agreement we'd finally signed would make my company the exclusive supply chain technology provider for all TechCore clients, generating guaranteed revenue that would fund our expansion into international markets. What made the partnership even more significant was the structure Mitchell had proposed. Rather than a simple licensing deal, TechCore would acquire a majority stake in my company while allowing me to maintain operational control as CEO. The valuation they'd agreed to was higher than I'd imagined possible, $85 million for a company I'd started with credit card debt and a laptop in a co-working space. The acquisition would be announced at Dad's recognition ceremony, partly because Mitchell wanted to demonstrate TechCore's commitment to innovation during a high-profile company event, and partly because he'd discovered during due diligence that the brilliant young CEO he was partnering with was the daughter of one of his most reliable project managers. The coincidence was too perfect to waste, especially since it would generate exactly the kind of positive publicity that technology companies craved. Mitchell had called me personally to discuss the announcement strategy. "Emma," he'd said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built a successful company from scratch. "I hope you understand that this partnership represents a validation of everything you've accomplished. What you've built isn't just impressive for someone your age, it's impressive, period. The fact that you've done it while your own family didn't understand what you were working on makes it even more remarkable." The conversation had been surreal. Not because of the business implications, but because Mitchell seemed to understand the family dynamics that I'd never explicitly discussed. "Your father talks about you sometimes," he'd continued. "He's proud of you, but he's also confused. He sees that you're intelligent and capable, but he can't figure out why you haven't translated those qualities into the kind of success he recognizes. Tonight's announcement is going to be quite an education for him." Now, sitting in the Palmer Events Center while Dad received recognition for 15 years of steady service, I was less than an hour away from the moment when my family would discover that their unemployed daughter had built something worth more than most people see in multiple lifetimes. The anticipation was overwhelming. Not because I needed their validation, but because I was curious to see how they would process information that contradicted everything they'd believed about my capabilities and choices. James Mitchell stepped up to the podium as the evening's keynote speaker, and I felt my pulse quicken despite my attempts to remain calm. He was an imposing figure, well over 6 feet tall with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that made people lean forward when he spoke. He'd built TechCore from a small consulting firm into one of Austin's most successful technology companies, and his opinion carried weight throughout the industry. "Good evening, everyone," Mitchell began, his voice carrying easily through the sound system. "Tonight we're here to celebrate not just individual achievements, but the collective success that comes from building something larger than ourselves. TechCore has grown because we've been fortunate to work with people who understand that innovation requires both vision and execution." He paused, scanning the audience with the practiced ease of someone who'd given hundreds of similar speeches. "Tonight I want to talk about the future of our industry and the partnerships that will define TechCore's next phase of growth. We've always prided ourselves on staying ahead of technological trends, but staying ahead requires more than just good intentions. It requires finding partners who aren't just keeping up with change, but driving it." My father was sitting straighter in his chair, probably wondering why the CEO was discussing partnership strategies at what was supposed to be an employee recognition ceremony. Mitchell had deliberately kept the agenda vague, describing his remarks only as, quote, "comments on TechCore's strategic direction." No one in the audience knew what was coming, including the TechCore executives who'd helped negotiate the partnership but hadn't been told about tonight's announcement. "6 months ago," Mitchell continued, "I had the opportunity to see a demonstration of technology that solved problems I didn't even know we had. The presenter was a young woman who'd built a supply chain management platform that could integrate with our existing systems while providing capabilities that our clients desperately needed. What impressed me wasn't just the technology itself, but the vision behind it." He clicked a remote, and the large screen behind him displayed the logo of my company, Chainlink Solutions. The audience murmured with recognition. Several TechCore employees had heard rumors about a major technology partnership, but the details had been carefully guarded. My family stared at the screen with the kind of confusion that comes from seeing something familiar in an unexpected context. Chainlink Solutions has revolutionized supply chain management for manufacturers across 6 different industries, Mitchell said, clicking to a slide that showed our client roster and revenue growth. In 3 years, they've grown from a startup to a company that processes over $2 billion in supply chain transactions annually. Their platform has reduced inventory costs by an average of 32%, while improving delivery times by 45%. The numbers were staggering enough that several people in the audience gasped audibly. Mom turned to look at Dad with an expression of bewilderment, probably wondering why Mitchell was spending so much time discussing a company they'd never heard of. Tyler was leaning forward, his legal training kicking in as he tried to process the implications of what he was hearing. "Tonight," Mitchell said, pausing for dramatic effect, "I'm pleased to announce that TechCore Solutions has entered into a strategic partnership with Chainlink Solutions that will transform how we serve our clients. We're acquiring a majority stake in Chainlink while maintaining their operational independence, creating a combined entity that will dominate the supply chain technology market." The applause was thunderous, but I could see my family sitting in stunned silence while everyone around them celebrated. They still didn't understand what any of this had to do with them, or why Mitchell was making this announcement at Dad's recognition ceremony. Mitchell waited for the applause to die down before delivering the final revelation. "The founder and CEO of Chainlink Solutions embodies everything we value at TechCore: innovation, determination, and the ability to see solutions where others see only problems. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Emma Rodriguez, who will be joining TechCore as our Chief Technology Officer while continuing to lead Chainlink as we expand into international markets." The spotlight swung to where I was sitting, and I stood slowly, raising my hand in acknowledgement as the audience erupted in applause. I could see my father's face clearly now, his expression cycling through confusion, shock, and something that might have been recognition. Tyler's mouth was literally hanging open. Mom had her hands pressed to her cheeks like she was trying to keep her face from falling apart. Mitchell gestured for me to join him on stage, and I walked down the aisle with as much composure as I could manage, while 200 people who'd never heard of me 5 minutes ago gave me a standing ovation. When I reached the podium, Mitchell shook my hand with genuine warmth. "Emma Rodriguez, everyone," he said into the microphone. "The brilliant young woman who built a company worth $85 million, while her family thought she was unemployed." The laughter was good-natured but pointed, and I could see Dad sink slightly in his chair as the full implication of Mitchell's words hit him. For 15 years, he'd worked for a man who now considered his supposedly unemployed daughter to be one of the most innovative minds in the technology industry. I took the microphone from Mitchell, looking out at an audience that was seeing me clearly for the first time. "Thank you, James, and thank you all for this warm welcome. Building Chainlink has been the most challenging and rewarding experience of my life, and I'm excited about what we can accomplish together with TechCore's resources and expertise." I paused, finding my family in the audience. I also want to acknowledge that success often looks different than we expect. 3 years ago, I was working from a coffee shop with a maxed-out credit card and a vision that most people thought was unrealistic. Tonight, I'm standing here as the CEO of a company that will change how entire industries operate. Sometimes the path that looks like failure is actually the road to something extraordinary. The applause was even louder this time, and I could see people throughout the audience nodding in recognition. Many of them had probably taken risks that others didn't understand, built companies or careers that required them to ignore conventional wisdom about what constituted safe and responsible choices. As I handed the microphone back to Mitchell and returned to my seat, I felt a weightlifting that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For 3 years, I'd been living in 2 worlds: the professional sphere where I was respected and successful, and the family sphere where I was seen as a work in progress. Tonight, those worlds had finally collided, and the collision had revealed that my family's concern had been based on incomplete information rather than accurate assessment. Walking back to my table, I passed my family's row and caught Dad's eye. He looked like a man who'd just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his daughter was wrong. There was pride there, but also something that might have been embarrassment at how completely he'd misunderstood what I'd been building. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of congratulations and business card exchanges. Industry colleagues I'd known for years approached to express excitement about the partnership. Venture capitalists who'd been considering investments in Chainlink wanted to discuss the new opportunities that TechCore's backing would create. Technology journalists asked for interviews about my plans for international expansion. But the conversation I was most interested in was the one that would happen after the ceremony ended, when my family would have to reconcile their perception of me as an underachieving daughter with the reality of me as a CEO who'd just closed one of the largest technology partnerships in Austin's history. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.